The doorbell rang just as I was setting out the snacks and drinks for a small gathering. The evening had barely started, with a handful of friends already settled in, chatting and laughing. It was supposed to be a low-key night, nothing wild or out of the ordinary. But then, there she was. I opened the door to find Karen, my neighbor, standing on the other side. She wasn't just any neighbor. She was the Karen, the kind of person who always seemed to have something to complain about. The kind who would call 911 because someone looked at her funny. The one who always thought she knew better than everyone else. And she was now on my doorstep, looking furious. "Do you know what time it is?" she snapped before I even had a chance to greet her. "You're being too loud. I've had enough of this nonsense." I stood there for a moment, processing her words. She was talking about my gathering, a small group of friends, with no more noise than a typical conversation. We weren't even playing music. But that didn't seem to matter to Karen. It was like she had nothing better to do than come over and start trouble. "Karen, we're just hanging out," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's not that loud, and no one is being disruptive." But she wasn't having any of it. Her expression twisted into a scowl as she stepped closer, almost as if she were trying to invade my personal space. "I don't care," she hissed. "It's too loud, and I'm not going to stand for it anymore. I'm calling the cops." And then, before I could even say anything else, she pulled out her phone. I could see her dialing 911, her fingers trembling slightly as she hit the number. My mind raced. Was she serious? Was she actually calling the police over a few people talking in my living room? This wasn't some out-of-control party. We were simply enjoying each other's company on a Friday evening. But apparently, that was enough for Karen to get her phone out and try to stir up trouble. I could feel the heat rising in my chest. The frustration was building up inside me, but I took a deep breath. The last thing I wanted was to escalate things even further. "Karen, there's no need to call the cops. This is ridiculous," I said, trying to de-escalate. She didn't listen. Instead, she continued talking to the 911 dispatcher, describing the supposed disturbance in exaggerated terms. I could hear her voice getting louder, more dramatic. I glanced back inside, where my friends were still chatting. They had no idea what was going on outside, and I didn't want to make them feel uncomfortable by involving them. But at the same time, I couldn't just let Karen get away with this. Karen was a problem, sure, but she wasn't going to ruin my evening. Not without a fight. The sound of sirens in the distance made my stomach churn. I couldn't believe this was happening. Little did I know this was just the beginning of what would turn into one of the most bizarre nights I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just about the noise or the phone call anymore. It was about what came next. And when those sirens got closer, I had no idea what was about to unfold. The sirens grew louder, the sound growing nearer with every passing second. My heart rate quickened as I stood frozen at the door, still watching Karen through the cracked opening. Her smug expression had only grown more intense as the 911 dispatcher responded to her frantic claims. My mind raced, the absurdity of the situation hitting me harder with each passing moment. Was this really happening? I turned back to my friends who were still inside, unaware of what was unfolding at the front door. The atmosphere in the living room had been lighthearted just moments ago. Conversations flowed easily, laughter echoed, and the relaxed buzz of the evening filled the air. But now there was a palpable shift in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Should we go check on her?" one of my friends, Derek, asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. Derek was a calm, collected guy, the kind who never let anything ruffle his feathers. But even he couldn't hide his disbelief at what Karen was doing. "No, let's just give it a minute," I said, trying to sound confident, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. I knew Karen. This wasn't going to be a simple, neighborly chat. This was going to escalate. She always had a way of making everything feel like a crisis. But I never imagined she would take it this far. Another friend, Natasha, gave me a look that said she was already trying to figure out what our next move would be. Natasha wasn't just a friend. She was a former lawyer and someone who had seen more than her fair share of situations like this. I could already tell she was preparing herself for some form of legal defense, even though, to me, the whole thing felt insane. The thought of the police showing up over something so trivial made me feel like I was in a bad comedy. The sirens grew closer, and my stomach twisted. "Let's just wait," I said again, though I was starting to feel less certain. The situation had already shifted from mildly annoying to surreal. Why would Karen even think that calling the police was the right move? And more importantly, what if the cops actually showed up and took her side? What if we were all pulled into some kind of mess that we didn't deserve? It wasn't long before a police car pulled up in front of the house. The flashing lights illuminated the street, casting an eerie glow across the front yard. My heart skipped a beat. I knew Karen was watching, probably gloating, convinced she was about to win somehow. But what she didn't know, and what I was starting to realize, was that the evening wasn't just about her. My guests weren't just regular people. They weren't here to make trouble, as Karen probably assumed. As I stood there, I glanced at Derek again. He had worked as a police officer for years before retiring early. And Natasha? She wasn't just a lawyer. She had once negotiated with criminals in high-stakes situations. I'd invited them here for a casual night, but neither of them was just anyone. They had experience, knowledge, and insight that could turn this situation upside down. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. This wasn't going to go the way Karen expected. In fact, I could already see her walking up to the police officers, phone in hand, preparing her dramatic monologue about how we were disturbing the peace. But what she hadn't considered was that my friends weren't just observers in this situation. They were experts who could handle anything that came their way. And as the first officer stepped out of his car and approached Karen, I realized something even more unsettling. This was far from over. Karen had called 911, but she didn't know that the real emergency was about to unfold, and it had nothing to do with noise complaints. As Karen stood there, puffed up with self-righteousness, the officer approached, his steps measured and deliberate. The blue and red lights from the police car painted the front yard in shifting shadows, giving the whole situation a surreal, almost cinematic vibe. But there was nothing cinematic about the tension that hung in the air. I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening, but there was a strange sense of inevitability, too. This was going to get interesting, whether I liked it or not. Karen was already halfway into her performance, talking over the officer's greeting, her voice rising in indignation. "Officer, you need to do something about this. It's an outrage," she exclaimed, her finger stabbing the air in our direction, as if we were criminals in the midst of some unspeakable act. I could hear her words echoing as the officer, a tall man with a professional but approachable demeanor, listened without interrupting. I knew he was trying to assess the situation, not wanting to make a hasty judgment based on a single side of the story. But Karen's dramatics were hard to miss. She recounted how the noise had kept her up for hours, something I knew wasn't true, considering we hadn't even been talking loudly. My friends, now gathered near the door, exchanged puzzled looks, the absurdity of the situation growing with every word that Karen spoke. Derek, who had spent years in law enforcement, was barely holding back a laugh, his arms crossed as he leaned against the doorframe. Natasha, on the other hand, looked like she was ready to pounce, her eyes narrowing slightly, assessing the officer's every move. They were both experts in their own right, but they knew this wasn't a situation to escalate too quickly. The best way to handle this was to stay calm and let the officer do his job. But what Karen didn't know, and what the officer hadn't yet realized, was that my guests weren't just ordinary people, they were professionals. Derek had spent years in law enforcement, Natasha had been a lawyer for over a decade, and even my friend Daniel had worked with negotiators in high-pressure situations. It wasn't long before one of my friends stepped forward to break the silence. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Derek said, his tone polite but firm. "I'm Captain Derek Williams, and I've worked in law enforcement for over 20 years. If there's a problem, I'd like to help resolve it." The officer looked at him, clearly surprised, but didn't show it. "Oh, I see. And you're all part of this gathering?" "Yes," Derek replied calmly, his presence commanding respect. "We're just here for a quiet evening. But I think my neighbor has mistaken normal conversation for something more." Karen's face flushed a deep shade of red as Derek continued to speak, introducing the rest of us as professionals in various fields. The realization seemed to hit her all at once. The people she had assumed were just noisy neighbors were, in fact, some of the most well-connected, well-versed individuals in their respective professions. My friends had the expertise to turn the tables in an instant, and Karen had no idea what she was up against. The officer, now fully aware of the situation, turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. There's no noise disturbance here. In fact, we've got a few people here who know a thing or two about law enforcement, law, and negotiation. I'd suggest we all have a calm conversation before we take any further action." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The smug expression on her face was quickly replaced with uncertainty. Her entire demeanor shifted as she realized her attempt to cause trouble wasn't going to play out the way she expected. She'd called 911 thinking she was going to be the victim, the one who was in the right, but now she was confronted with the reality that her actions might not only make her look ridiculous, but could land her in even more trouble. As the officer prepared to leave, he turned to me. "If there's no further issue, I suggest we all go our separate ways. However, I would advise you to be mindful of the noise level in the future, ma'am," he said to Karen, his voice now more authoritative. Karen muttered something under her breath as the officer walked back to his car, leaving her standing there, defeated. As the sirens faded into the distance, the tension melted away, and we all stepped back into the warmth of the living room, the absurdity of the evening still hanging in the air. But I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Karen may have thought she had the upper hand, but in the end it was clear. You can't win when you're up against the unexpected. The tension in the air was thick as Karen stood frozen, processing the reality of what had just happened. Her eyes darted back and forth between the officer, who was now returning to his patrol car, and the group of us who had witnessed the whole ordeal. She had been so confident, so certain that her call to 911 would result in some kind of justice, but instead she was left standing there, humiliated. I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she realized that the tables had completely turned. Karen had underestimated my friends, people who weren't just ordinary guests at my house. They weren't just talking heads or random bystanders. They were seasoned professionals, experts in their fields, and Karen had no idea what kind of people she was dealing with. As the officer's car disappeared into the distance, the air around us seemed to clear. My friends exchanged glances, some suppressing grins, while others looked like they were ready to burst out laughing. But they held it together, not wanting to escalate things further. The reality of the situation was clear to all of us now. Karen had called the cops, expecting to be the star of some drama, but instead, she'd ended up the villain in her own little story. "Do you think she'll try something else?" Natasha asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and caution. Her lawyer instincts were sharp, always thinking several steps ahead, and I could tell she was already analyzing Karen's next potential move. "I wouldn't put it past her," Derek replied, his voice steady. "But I think she knows she's out of her league now. If she tries anything else, we're ready for her." The words hung in the air, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment. Karen had been the one who wanted to make this a big deal, but now the power had shifted. What she didn't know was that her actions had only made us more united. The bond between my friends and me had been strengthened, and the unspoken understanding was clear. We weren't about to let Karen win. But as the evening wore on, Karen wasn't the only one who had a few lessons to learn. We had all learned something important too, about standing up for what's right, and not backing down in the face of adversity. My friends weren't just colleagues in their respective fields. They were people who believed in fairness and justice. And in that moment, we had done what we needed to do. Not just defend ourselves, but send a message. After a while, the laughter in the living room resumed. The tension from before had faded, replaced with the comfort of knowing that we had handled the situation with grace and composure. Derek made a joke about Karen's over-the-top dramatics, and we all laughed, the tension of the evening now completely gone. But in the back of my mind, I knew that this wasn't over. The night might have ended peacefully, but Karen's story was far from finished. Later that night, as the last of my guests left and the house fell silent, I took a deep breath, reflecting on everything that had happened. Karen had tried to make herself out to be the victim, but in the end, it was clear. Her attempt to create chaos had only revealed her true nature. She had underestimated the power of unity, the power of people who knew exactly how to handle a situation like this. As I locked the door and turned off the lights, I felt a sense of relief, but also a small bit of victory. Karen had failed in her quest to disrupt my evening, and I couldn't help but smile at the thought of how things had played out. The night had been chaotic, yes, but it had also been a reminder that sometimes it's not the loudest voices that win. It's the ones who know how to stay calm, stay united, and stand their ground when it matters most. And with that, I knew that no matter what Karen tried next, we would be ready. The evening might have ended, but the lesson had just begun.